Good morning, good afternoon and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining the latest IATA Global Media Briefing. Today we're going to focus on a subject which has been a bright spot for the industry throughout the pandemic, air cargo. We have an exciting lineup of speakers for you today, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through the agenda in a lot of detail. You can see it on the screen now, and we're also going to post it on the chat function. Now I'd like to introduce the first three speakers. Willie Walsh, our Director General, who's going to give an overview of the past year and a half and the priorities for the coming year. Nick Careen, our Senior Vice President, Airport, Passenger, Cargo and Security, who's going to talk about an issue that's the key priority, remains a key priority for the industry, safety, specifically lithium batteries. And then moving on to Brian Pearce, our Chief Economist, who's going to give an overview of the performance of the air cargo industry. After that, there'll be an opportunity to ask some question and answers before we move to the rest of the cargo leadership team for a deeper dive into key subjects affecting air cargo. Willie, I'd like to pass over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon from Geneva, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. It's a terrible shame we're not able to meet you in person, but hopefully it's only a matter of time before we can get back to having face-to-face presentations. So we've got a busy presentations for you today. I just want to give you a general overview of my observations of the cargo business over the past 15 months. Clearly, as you've heard already, this has been the bright spot for airlines in what otherwise has been a very, very dark environment. And I think airlines deserve great credit, and you may have heard me say this before, but I genuinely believe they deserve great credit for being able to pivot their business away from passenger and towards air freight in a very short period of time, demonstrating great agility in responding to the demand to ensure that there was sufficient supply to meet critical supply chain issues during this pandemic. It hasn't been easy for airlines because, quite honestly, they've had to reverse their business model. Normally, airlines look at the incremental cost of carriage of air freight. This time round, it's very much focused on the incremental cost of the passenger, because what airlines have been able to do in a very short period of time is to justify putting a lot of passenger aircraft operating cargo-only flights, freighters as some people have called them. And this has really required quite a lot of work on the part of management teams right across the world, but it has ensured that sufficient supply has been made available. So while, as you'll see from Pearce's presentation in a few moments, while demand during 2020 did fall, it was still way in excess of the capacity that would have been available from cargo-only aircraft. So it was actually critical that airlines were able to demonstrate their flexibility and provide additional capacity operating passenger aircraft to carry, in many cases, very critical supplies at the beginning and through this pandemic. So it's been a challenging period for airlines, but cargo has performed well, and the outlook for cargo remains positive. As you'll see in Brian's presentation, the global economic environment remains pretty robust, surprisingly, given what's gone on. I look at the fuel price as a good barometer of economic demand, and with Brent still in the $67, $68 range, clearly demonstrates that there is demand out there, which gives us reasons to be optimistic around the recovery of passenger traffic, but more importantly also gives us reasons to be optimistic about ongoing demand for air freight as we go through 2021. 2020 was a very difficult year. 2021 has been challenging, maybe not on the same scale, but still very challenging for airlines. I think we'll see an improving environment given the accelerated rollout of vaccines and the clear scientific evidence that this is having a positive impact on suppressing the spread of the virus. So second half of this year should see further relaxation in government travel restrictions, which will enable airlines to restart international travel and start building up to a more normal situation going into 2022. So as we go through this period, our industry will shift its focus away from survival, and we've clearly been in that survival mode now for the past 15 months, to rebuilding. And as that happens, we will continue to be very focused on the environmental issues that have not in any way abated as we've gone through this crisis. So at IATA, our immediate focus, be it for passenger or cargo operations, has been to ensure that airlines can survive through this crisis. We're trying to encourage governments to take a better risk-based approach to the opening of borders to enable international travel to start again. But as we get through this, we will continue to be very focused on environmental concerns, and that applies to cargo as much as it does to passenger operations. Everybody in the supply chain has been looking at how they can improve the environmental performance of their part of that chain. We've seen an acceleration of change to electric vehicles on the ramp. This clearly isn't on the same scale as we get from reducing CO2 from aircraft, where the immediate focus is on the development of sustainable aviation fuels. So we will continue to look at ways and means of improving our environmental performance as we go through this. All the time, however, being very focused on safety, and you're going to hear from Nick on some of these issues. The carriage of lithium-ion batteries, high-energy devices, has been a challenge for some time. We all know how dangerous these batteries can be. They ignite, and clearly ensuring that we can transport these devices safely on board aircraft is a primary focus of IATA. A lot of work going on behind the scenes, but I'll leave it to Nick to talk to you about some of the issues that we're doing there. And, providing a digital solution has got to be a key priority for us. Cargo has lagged significantly behind passenger when it's come to digital solutions. We have made some good progress, but we need to accelerate this. We need to do more, not just because of the efficiency it will give us, the improvement in time, the improvement in cost, but also the significant improvement in data. And data works to all of the critical areas that we're talking about. Better data enables us to operate more efficiently and improve our environmental performance. Better data enables us to assess the risk in a better way, and that enables us to improve our safety performance. And clearly, better data is something that everybody wants to focus on, and you're going to hear much more on this as we go through the presentations today. So a great year for cargo, a terrible year for airlines. Great credit to everybody involved in the transportation of air freight for what you've been able to do to ensure that airlines have continued to supply critical capacity through this period. But absolutely no letting up in terms of the external pressures on our industry. So therefore, improving the efficiency of our business, improving the environmental performance of our business, and accelerating the digitalization of air freight will be the priorities for IATA, for my team, and I'm sure for all of you as we go through the coming months. I'm going to hand over now to Nick, who will make some comments in relation to our safety focus, which is, as always, top priority for all airlines and for everyone at IATA. Thank you.
Thanks, Willie, and thanks everybody for joining us here today. As Willie pointed out, cargo has had a very successful year, a lot of which was out of necessity, and creation. As a result of that, we've seen some creativity that's probably been lagging in many years in terms of cargo. The pandemic, ironically, was a good thing for cargo. But as Willie points out, the passenger side of the business and airlines in general continue to suffer at the hands of lack of transparency, coordination, cooperation, collaboration, and every other Asian word you can think of. However, today, a very short period of time, because we've got a lot to cover, but I wanted to touch on one particular area that is of concern to us. Safety and security remains number one priority in our industry. It always has. There's not one member, there's not one airline that does not have safety and security as its number one priority. And lithium batteries, as an example, is something that we transport on a regular basis very successfully. However, the most recent incident in Hong Kong illustrates to us, it only takes a smoking pallet with flames out of it for us to realize how risky things truly are and how important it is that we fix things and we continue to manage risks as risks grow. The demand for lithium battery, as an example, continues to expand. And as a result, it requires us to be a little bit more focused. It requires IATA to take a leadership role on the supply chain to fix this issue once and for all. It needs collaboration with everybody involved, in particular with governments, because the lack of accountability and the lack of involvement, and quite frankly, in many cases, just pointing out the finger or making responsibility of the airlines only, is just not the way to fix this issue once and for all. So what we're proposing over the course of the next couple of weeks will be to pull together an industry-led group of people looking for support from our cargo industry, from our flight operations and safety industry, and from governments around the world to begin to isolate where we need to place that focus. Areas such as testing, which we are lagging behind on, areas such as fire suppression and fire containment, which we can improve upon, and we are lacking standards in, as well as data and the sharing of that data. Is something that's where we have been a little bit reluctant to do, but it's very, very important that we begin to isolate this issue to a large degree, to illustrate where the problems are, to find the fixes that are required in order for us to make us even safer than we are today. And then lastly, I think it's around accountability. There's been nobody's ever been criminalized or held criminally responsible for all of these risks that have been introduced into our supply chain by rogue shippers. That has changed. So we do need to see a move in that direction in terms of more criminalization of the activities to illustrate when someone takes the risks of everybody involved in their own hands by being rogue, they should be held accountable for that. And we should also be able to share that information amongst ourselves to make sure that we deal with this once and for all. So Brian has a much cheerier presentation in terms of illustrating where the industry has gone over the last number of months. And I'm glad that I'm kind of in the second group of people to illustrate that, there's a lot of great things happening in cargo, but we can't take our eye off the ball. Safety and security is paramount importance, and this particular item has been something we've talked about for years. And it's important to know we are safe, but we could be so much better. And over the course of the next number of weeks and months as we move ahead, you will hear lots about this particular item and others, but this one in for sure, as we move to make us safer and more secure. So with that, I think I turn it over to Brian, and Brian can take us through the presentation in terms of the performance of the cargo industry at large. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nick. We could move to the next slide. Yeah, so air cargo services are in really strong demand at the moment, and I think from this chart here you can see why. Because if we look at either global industrial production or the volume of cross-border trade, we've actually seen quite a strong V-shaped recovery from the depths of the crisis, and shippers, companies need air cargo to rapidly transport components and final products to market as the global economy recovers. If we move to the next slide, we can see the impact that this has had on the cargo ton kilometres flown. It's a very, as you can see, it's a very seasonal business. The latest data point was March, which is normally a good month. The dotted line shows those seasonal variations smoothed out, but I think it's pretty clear from both that we are above pre-crisis levels. In fact, we're about 4 or 5% above the sort of levels of the business we saw before the crisis in March 2019. So strong recovery and obviously a marked contrast to the passenger business. But if we dig below those numbers, it's not equally strong on all trade lanes. And if you look at the next slide, we can see that there's quite a bit of variation in cargo ton kilometres flown on different trade lanes. The strong markets, and these are segment flows rather than origin destinations. So, those two strong markets, Middle East to Europe, Middle East to Asia, those are the Middle East airlines flying cargo through their Gulf hubs. But also the North Pacific has been really strong, reflecting the fact that we're seeing a very strong Chinese economy, very strong US economy, and that's generating a lot of trade. So those markets, very strong. By contrast, Europe obviously has had repeated economic lockdowns, and the economy is weaker. So some of those key trade lanes there have not been quite as strong. Better than the depths of the crisis, not quite as strong. And this different pattern across the trade lanes has affected the experience of airlines based in different regions, which is shown in the next slide. It's no surprise that the North American airlines are performing best in terms of the volumes of their businesses. They're 20% up on pre-crisis levels, pretty close behind are the Middle East airlines as well. Big contrast between what's happening in North and what's happening in Latin America. And that's not just a reflection of the different trade lanes. Actually, some of the markets between North and South America are reasonably strong. But the crisis that the Latin American airlines have faced, and that to a large part is because the governments in those regions have not provided the support that airlines in the North and other parts of the world have. So you're seeing a number of the big airlines in Latin America under bankruptcy protection, under reorganizing. As a result, they've been losing market share. Moving to the next slide, we've seen obviously overall very strong demand. We've also seen very high load factors, which are some 10 percentage points higher than they would normally have been. And this has reflected what we heard earlier. There's been a really severe capacity shortage in the industry, because typically 50% or so of cargo would be carried in the holds of passenger aircraft, which to a large part have been grounded and remain grounded because of the travel restrictions. And that's led to very high loads on the aircraft that have been able to fly. It's also meant that yields have been very high. And that's clearly benefited the revenues of those airlines that have been in that business or have pivoted to that business. I think both of those features, high load factors, high yields, are probably going to be temporary. We think they will continue this year, but they really reflect the unusual situation, which you can see in the next slide, which is that although if we look at the change in freighter capacity relative to 2019 levels, those are the red bars, you can see that freighters, we've got about 20% more capacity in our freighter fleet in terms of ton kilometres available than before the crisis. Yet we still have an overall shortage of capacity to serve the demand that there is. The black line shows that because the passenger fleet is still not back up in the air to the extent it was, we're seeing a shortage of capacity of 12-13%. And that's the reason that load factors are high. That's the reason that yields are high. Obviously, as travel barriers come down, that situation will normalise. But airlines have been doing what they can to respond to this capacity shortage. And if we look at the next slide, you can see on three major trade lanes, Asia to the Middle East, Europe to the Middle East, and Middle East to North America, the role of the so-called freighter, which are represented by the red bars here. Obviously, there are some long-haul passenger services in operation as normal, but much less, and cargo is being carried in the holds of those aircraft. But airlines have also been deploying passenger aircraft for all cargo operations, the so-called freighters, and you can see they've been performed a really important role in providing capacity on some of these markets. The other thing, if we move to the next slide, is the role that cargo has played in actually sustaining the connectivity on some long-haul routes, even across the transatlantic market. What we've seen, first of all, is that the passenger revenues on all of these markets is much, much less than before. And what we've modelled here are the sort of typical economics of a Boeing 777-300 operation on these markets. And as you can see here, the revenue from business and economy passengers is tiny, much, much less than normal. Cargo is providing between sort of 40 and on the Middle East or Asian market, 65% of total revenues. And that's sufficient to more or less make those flights either cash break even or cash positive. And that's actually sustaining connectivity on some of those long haul markets for passengers, connectivity that otherwise wouldn't be in place. And if we move to the next slide, you can see the overall contribution that the cargo business has made to the airline industry. The green bars show the proportion, the percentage of total airline industry operating revenues represented by the cargo business. So you can see before last year, cargo typically represented sort of 10 or 15% of revenues. So, significant, but not the most important part of the business. That changed radically last year. Last year, cargo represented over 35% of revenues. This year, as the passenger business is expected to start to come back, well, it's starting to come back already on domestic markets, and we expect international markets to start opening up as vaccination rolls out in the second half of this year. That contribution will diminish, but even so, cargo is expected to play a critical role this year for many airlines, if not most airlines, representing some 30% of total revenues. Every quarter, we do a survey of heads of cargo to take their pulse. It's our business confidence survey, and you can see in the next slide the results. This is a long time series. We've been doing this every quarter since early 2008. The latest taking of the temperature of heads of cargo was in April, so last month. They're pretty confident about the next 12 months. The blue line shows the level of their confidence for cargo volumes over the next 12 months. So, they're pretty much expecting the same sort of growth that we saw pre-crisis. So, a positive outlook. And for yields, that reading suggests they're expecting sort of fairly stable yields. So the business is pretty confident about the future. And then if we move to the next and final slide, this is our expectation, our forecast for growth in the cargo market this year in 2021 after the decline that we saw in 2020. And the red line shows the World Trade Organization's forecast for overall cross-border trade, international world trade. As you can see, we're expecting air cargo to outperform other modes of transport. And if we look back at the global financial crisis, that's what happened then in the recovery period. Shippers need air cargo for the rapid transport of components and final goods, obviously as well as vaccines, to the market. And so global overall world trade is expected to grow by 8% this year. We're expecting to see air cargo volumes grow by in excess of 13%. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian. We'll now go to a Q&A session for about 15 minutes before we do the deeper dives into air cargo. Willie, we'll start with a question from you on environmental sustainability for the industry. How important do you think environmental sustainability is for your cargo? Are we seeing pressure from customers to be more sustainable? And do you think the industry is going to come under pressure to retire some of the older cargo aircraft?
Yeah, it's absolutely critical. Everything that we have seen tells us that the focus on environmental performance has strengthened as we've come through this crisis. Unlike what we witnessed in 2008, 2009, after the collapse of Lehman's in 2007, when the focus on the environment started easing. It was still an important issue for people, but not the number one item on their agenda. This time round, we're seeing on all the surveys we do that environmental concerns remain very high, if not at the top of people's agendas. So, all elements of the business will come under pressure. I think the industry has a good track record in terms of what we've done to improve our environmental performance, but we clearly have to do more. One of the things we have seen, as you all know, from the passenger side, as we've gone through 2020, was the retirement of older aircraft, many of which were due to be retired in the next 3 to 5 years. But this crisis has accelerated that retirement profile. That clearly will have a significant benefit in terms of the environmental performance of the aircraft that will be flying. It's not going to be enough, hence the reason we're focused initially on sustainable aviation fuels, which we think is part of the medium-term solution for the industry. But every part of the industry is going to have to play their part. And I think there will be increasing pressure once we've got through the capacity crunch that we're seeing at the moment. As Brian has said, once we see passenger aircraft, wide-body passenger aircraft coming back into service, I think there will be less of a need for some of the older freighters that have continued to operate through 2020. Some of those, I believe, would have been retired by now had the crisis not happened. But in our opinion at IATA, we're all going to have to play our part, and it'll be critical because increasingly we're seeing investors, customers, suppliers, and the population in general looking at the aviation industry to ensure that we do everything we can to improve our environmental performance.
Thank you, Willie. Another question for you. More airlines are saying that cargo rather than passenger traffic or demand is driving network planning. How could this translate into issues such as slot allocation? And is there a risk that governments could start using traffic rights, cargo traffic rights, as bargaining tools?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think that governments will use cargo traffic rights as a bargaining tool. I think all governments have witnessed the critical importance of having an efficient air cargo environment as we've gone through this crisis. But you're absolutely right. Network planning teams have had to look at networks in a completely different way. Better understand the standalone profitability of cargo operations. As most people will know, if you're a passenger airline, cargo is seen as an ancillary activity. It doesn't really drive network plans. It does have a big impact on network issues because clearly the contribution that cargo makes can make the difference between a route being profitable or a route being loss-making. And I know from personal experience, anytime we looked at launching a new long-haul route, not so much on short-haul, but certainly on a new long-haul route, the contribution that cargo could make was a critical factor in that. But ultimately, the decision as to whether to launch was driven by passenger. That is changing. It certainly has changed over the past 12 months. I think probably from April or May of last year, network planning teams completely reversed their approach to the network. And as Brian has said, in many cases, passenger flights have been solely facilitated by the fact that there was cash positive cargo flying available. Had that cargo activity not been there, many of the destinations that continue to be served on an international basis today would not be served because there was insufficient passenger demand, principally because people were restricted from flying. I think once those restrictions are removed, it will change. So I expect things to return to a more normal. But the real positive out of this is a much greater appreciation within network planning teams of the valuable contribution that cargo makes. I'm not sure that it was fully appreciated by those teams on a historical basis, but I think they certainly understand it much, much better now.
Thanks. Willie, another question for you, following on from that question. As passenger aircraft return, should freighters have reserved slots at the major cargo hubs?
Yeah, I'm always reluctant. I'm always reluctant to say that slots should be earmarked or carved out for certain activities, because I think that can lead to an inefficient business. And, this is an industry that can't afford any levels of inefficiency. I think what you've seen is, where slots have been required at the traditionally slot-constrained airports, they've been made available. I think that will continue to be the case. But I would be very reluctant to say that we should start now carving out slots solely for allocation to cargo operations. As I said, my fear there is it leads to a suboptimal airline profitability or revenue generating network, and that clearly would have negative consequences for both passenger and cargo going forward. So where there's demand for a slot for a cargo operation, in the next couple of years, I see absolutely no challenge in those slots being available, because we don't expect passenger activity to get back to where we were in 2019 for some time to come. So there are likely to be slots available at airports that were traditionally slot constrained for some time, maybe 2-3 years. And I think cargo will be able to take full advantage of that.
Thank you, Brian. 2 questions for you. The first one is, why is IATA comparing 2021 results to 2019 and not 2020? And the second thing is the questioner notes that the performance on Asia Pacific seemed to be slightly, well below North America. And why is that the case when some of the biggest trade lanes originate out of Asia Pacific?
So what we're doing here is comparing performance today with the pre-crisis situation, just because last year was so extraordinary. And I think what's relevant for airlines, but also for the wider economy, is how are air cargo services performing relative to those pre-crisis times. So that's the reason for the comparison with 2019. In fact, if we compared it to March 2020, the numbers would be actually even more positive because of the dip that we saw at the start of the crisis. So the second part of the question was that the North American airlines have benefited more than the Asia Pacific airlines in shipping cargo. And so traditionally, I guess, because Asia is the manufacturing center of the world, typically the cargo is a much bigger part of Asia Pacific Airlines business. I think that reflects, first of all, the strength of the US economy. The US economy has been, outside of China, one of the strongest performing economies, and there's an important role for cargo within North America, and that's partly related to what you'll hear a little later on about e-commerce, because this shift that we've seen in retail services means that air transport plays a critical role in getting products to consumers. So e-commerce is an important driver as well, and perhaps internationally that's not quite as well developed as it is domestically. And then the other factor, I guess, is that for the Asia Pacific Airlines, remember it's not just the Chinese airlines that we're talking about here. We've got some economies like India, for example, that are in quite a lot of trouble at the moment because of the extent of the coronavirus.
Thanks, Brian. Another question for you. The question asks, what proportion of revenues do you expect air cargo to contribute to overall airline revenues in the years to come as the passenger recovery continues?
Well, as I said, pre-crisis, those revenues were between 10 and 15% of total airline revenues, and now, 30 to 35%, a much greater proportion, and obviously on some routes, they've been critical. As the passenger fleet comes back, I'd expect to see that proportion, returning towards where we were pre-crisis. But because we're not expecting to see international air transport, and so particularly those long-haul routes, really come back to normal for several years, because of the slowness of the vaccination rollout in the emerging markets, and therefore the expected reluctance of a complete relaxation of travel restrictions. The passenger fleet will be. It'll take a couple of years to fully recover. So I think it will only be a slow decline. Cargo will continue for the next few years to play a bigger role than it did before the crisis.
Thanks, Brian. Nick, question for you on lithium batteries. There's been a bit of a proliferation in lithium battery incidents over the past few years. Surely the solution, or was the solution not be to stop carrying them? That's the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, a few years ago, or recently, I initiated discussions with lithium battery manufacturers across the world. Can you tell us the status of these engagements, particularly in the light of the incident at Hong Kong Airport recently?
Proliferation is a big word. I think there's been some sensational examples. I would not go as far as to say there's been a proliferation. The problem is that growing reliance on the movement of lithium batteries. I think it's also important to recognize that it is safe, and airlines around the world take great caution, as well as airports and manufacturers, as well as those that follow the rules do a good job at moving it. What we're suggesting is that there are a lot of risks involved here that need more fine-tuning. So to suggest an all-out ban, we're not at that point. So, and nor do we, foresee ourselves being at that point. Not now. But we do need to take the time to take a step back in terms of understanding what else we can do, which I'd mentioned in terms of suppression, in terms of containment, in terms of testing, in terms of data sharing, in terms of criminality and accountability. These things that we have not been able to fix yet. So let's start there first, and you can ask me that question again in 6 months' time to see the progress we've made, and then we can determine what our next steps are in terms of what we should be recommending as an organization. In terms of our work around the movement, it's been good. I mean, we've put a lot of standards in place in terms of what these charges need to be at. Those who follow the rules is not a problem. The problem here is those who choose not to follow the rules. And so that's where the focus means, and the rest of it's around containment, about minimizing and mitigating risks, where we talk about suppression. So I think by and large the rules are okay. It's there's some fringes here that we need to address.
Thanks, Nick. Willie, another question for you. Could you give us a bit more detail on the strategy for improving digitalisation of processes across the air cargo industry, and also where is the money going to come from for this? Obviously, the industry is under a lot of financial pressure at the minute.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's always difficult in the airline industry to set aside money to invest in something that will have benefit in the future. Airline CEOs and CFOs are always looking for an immediate return, and never more so than when you're going through a crisis. But I can tell you that the benefit that cargo will see having come through this is that people will better appreciate the significant financial contribution that cargo can make to the business. It has been the difference between life and death for many airlines. The cash generated by cargo has been very important through this. And I think you'll see greater awareness and a greater preparedness to invest some of the cash that cargo does generate into a digital transformation, which has clearly been of huge value to the passenger side of the business. Now, you're going to hear more about this in a presentation that you'll get in a few minutes from the team. But we've been working on a program called One Records, which is about creating a single standard. And as we know in our industry, a single standard is very important. If everybody is working from the same basis, it clearly makes the industry more efficient. And if we can have a single standard, then data can be exchanged in a much more efficient way. So I'm absolutely convinced that money will be made available. Every airline is continuing to invest in projects, even through this crisis, because they recognize they have to prepare their business for the future. The awareness of the contribution that cargo makes, as I said, is much greater today than it has been. And as you've seen from Brian's presentations and the answers that he's given you, that contribution is likely to continue to be at a much higher level than is traditional for the next few years. So I'm convinced that there is sufficient funds available to make the investments. These investments aren't always significant, because in many ways we can leverage off the back of work that was done on the passenger side of the business. But without question, the benefit is very significant, and it will benefit the industry on all key areas. It'll improve environmental performance, it will improve safety performance, it will improve the efficiency of our business, it can improve revenue generation, because again, more data makes you more efficient, enables you to utilize that valuable space in the cargo hold of the aircraft in a better way. So you'll hear more in a few minutes on that, and I'll leave it to Hank and the rest of the team to take you through that.
Thanks, Willie. Another question for you. Brian spoke about a normalisation of trends, but could the shift to online shopping favour air cargo over slower shipping links? And do you think airlines that have exited dedicated freighter operations will look to revisit those decisions?
I think e-commerce is one of those big transformational shifts that we occasionally see, and it's clear that the coronavirus crisis has given that shift to online shopping an additional push. And air cargo plays a really important role, because consumers want to get the product quickly. So yes, I think that this is going to be one of those important drivers of growth in the air cargo sector. One of the important services that air cargo provides to consumers, the e-commerce side. Will that require a rethink of freighters? Possibly. I think we've already said, haven't we, that the experience of the last 18 months has, I think, shown airline management the importance of air cargo. So I think there is going to be a lot of rethinking going on, which could favour more freighters.
Thanks, Brian. Willie, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would agree with what Brian. I would agree with what Brian has said. But I think another factor is that airlines will have assets available for potential cargo conversion, particularly efficient wide-body twin-engined aircraft. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some airlines look at the possibility of doing cargo conversions on aircraft like A330s. Very efficient aircraft, got great cargo capacity, and given the demand that's likely to exist, I think you could make a business case for converting some of these aircraft, given that it's likely that demand for cargo, given everything we've said, will continue for some period of time, and the supply of capacity from the traditional wide-body passenger aircraft is not going to get back to the levels we saw in 2019 for some time. So that could play into some airlines going back into dedicated freighters.
Thanks, Willie. Brian, quick question for you. The 2021 projections for air cargo to grow 13.1% on 2021, is that against 2020 or 2019?
Okay, yeah, that is against 2020 levels.
Perfect. Thanks, Brian. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. We're going to now move to the second part of Cargo Media Day. And I'd now like to pass over to Andrea Gruber, our Head of Special Cargo, who's going to talk to us about the biggest logistics challenge our industry's ever faced, the transport of COVID-19 vaccinations. Andrea, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Catherine. Good day, everyone. The vaccine and pharmaceutical logistics and distribution remains the biggest logistic challenge. Next slide, please. The airfare industry has been handling and transporting vaccines and pharmaceuticals and life science products. This is not new, but the challenge was really the scale in which this would happen and the duration also, as it's expected to last over the months and the coming years. And if we look at the few figures, we have researchers are currently testing 90 vaccines in clinical trials on humans, and 27 have reached the final stage of testing. 8 vaccines are approved for full use. So if we look at the global population of 7.8 billion people, so far, 1.18 billion vaccines vaccine doses have been administered worldwide, 12.1 billion doses secured globally, 4.06 billion doses secured and optioned through COVAX, and 59.2 million doses shipped through COVAX, 222 countries. And for that to happen, next slide, please. Pharmaceutical and life science products really require stringent handling and transport conditions, or potentially medicines lose its potency and may become ineffective. So while our cargo processes are actually very robust, and the key role that air cargo plays in distributing vaccines in normal time goes totally unquestioned, what was and still is critical is really to ensure vaccine shipments, integrity, safety, and security. So with the COVID-19 situation, some of the requirements to handle and transport vaccines have been placed in jeopardy due, amongst other things, to operational, infrastructure, and staff issues around the network. When we look at the infrastructure itself, the availability and the visibility of capabilities, specialized temperature control infrastructure, facilities, equipment, and dedicated resources are effectively essential, and these remains a challenge in remote areas. Packaging should be appropriate and in place, especially to support the extra capacity on the ground. When we look at staff, essential workers must be authorized to work to support the transportation of vaccines, and training is paramount to a successful implementation. Staff should be trained on risk, quality, and handling processes and procedures to deal with the time and temperature sensitive pharma products. Next slide, please. In the early stage of the coronavirus pandemic, IATA has been calling for increased collaboration, coordination, and communication, and these efforts are undoubtedly the foundation for successfully achieving the industry common goal. And the success really depends on the comprehensive and early planning, close and ongoing communication, but perhaps above all and most importantly, it's the commitment to implementation. IATA has been engaging with shippers, manufacturers, supply chain partners, authorities, and international bodies to exchange information, best practices, and guidance to ensure the risks that have been identified were addressed, understood, and mitigated. And as a communication channel, IATA has released end of March its 4th edition of the guidance for vaccines and pharmaceutical logistics and distribution, with the contribution of various organizations such as the WTO, ICAO, the World Bank, IATA, PAO, World Food Programme, UNICEF. And a 5th and final edition will be released by June, as this document serves the purpose of sharing information and to facilitate targeted and comprehensive planning with industry stakeholders, really to ensure the preparedness when vaccines for COVID-19 are approved and available for distribution. And in terms of partnership, next slide, please. And assisting the global distribution of vaccine, what was really key was to provide the transparency on cargo capacity and connectivity and expected requirement. And actually, in this context, IATA, UNICEF, and PAO and major global airlines organized a virtual meeting that led to the UNICEF Humanitarian Air Freight Initiative. And this collaboration resulted in the signature of a memorandum of understanding on February the 1st between IATA and UNICEF to increase opportunities to mobilize support from the air freight industry for the preparedness and for the delivery of COVID-19 vaccines under the COVID-19 Vaccine Global Access Facility, the COVAX. So next slide, please. The awareness campaign for the logistics industry to really be ready and prepared for the large scale of vaccine transport and distribution has proven to be quite constructive. And the industry supply chain stakeholders have been proactively taking the lead to organize themselves in identifying the needs. IATA is actually assisting the industry to be ready and prepared with a number of different tools, materials, such as the guidance material I just spoke about, regulations, training, certifications, and a registry for all certified organizations, all with the aim to mitigating the risk. Because when transporting temperature-sensitive pharmaceutical products, quality is key and cannot be jeopardized. And in terms of standardization, non-standardized processes have a detrimental impact, and that's why training is a prerequisite. This means that in the long term, a network of sustainable infrastructure, technology-driven initiatives, and people are really needed. Global standards must be implemented, reviewed, and maintained through robust audit processes. And if this is achieved properly, the benefit will result positively and impact everyone's life. And on the digital side, maybe just a few words on providing transparency and visibility to manufacturers and logistic providers of the level of infrastructure and operations, which is really key for them, especially when they do risk mitigations or trade lane risk assessment. IATA developed the OneSource industry platform for validated aviation capabilities and infrastructure information for that purpose. This is a free online repository where all the IATA certified supply chain partners are listed, and they are listing actually their existing facility and infrastructure capabilities. This is visible and can be accessed from the platform. IATA has a number of different certifications when it comes to the smart facility and the audit reduction commitment or the CIV programs, all the capabilities, information of their capacity capabilities, warehouse capacity are available on that platform. And today, as you see on the slide, we have a number of companies, more than 700 companies that have already registered to that platform. So I suggest you go on our website where this is available. I'd like now to go on and to the next slide and provide you with some lessons learned and some examples. Most of them are actually developed in the guidance document, which I will not go into too much detail, but let me just take some few important ones. When we look at the COVID-19 vaccine, stringent temperatures have been the key challenge, but it's not the only one. Once the vaccines are in refrigerated state and intended for distribution, caution must be exercised to handle it with care to avoid shocks, drops, and vibration, which can be as difficult and challenging as the temperature, and because it could cause a degradation of the product. In terms of capacity, I will not go into details because my colleagues, and especially Brian with the Economical Outlook, has provided you with the information on the capacity constraint. But what is really important is that governments need to reestablish air connectivity to ensure adequate capacities available for the pharmaceutical distribution. One aspect that is clear is that the lessons learned from the distribution of the PPE in early 2020 really helped the industry and the distribution effort. We've seen as well the work with the humanitarian organization, whether it's the World Food Programme or UNICEF. They are really calling on airlines to dedicate enough space to transport vaccines across the globe. And the air freight industry, and especially the supply chain, has been managing positively the first rollout of the vaccines. UNICEF has actually confirmed that in the 117 countries where the vaccines was first delivered, the transport schedule reliability was 100%. Considering the current circumstances, this really illustrates and gives the industry the confidence that the airline industry has been prepared and has understood the requirement, which also gives confidence for even more challenging period that will be coming in the second half of the year with more vaccines availability and also going towards 2022. On the regulatory side, and I will not go into too much details, on the dangerous goods side, the use of dry ice as a refrigerant for vaccine has raised some operational challenges, namely on the acceptance process. Because where there are significant numbers of packages of vaccines that contain dry ice, the time to accept packages increases significantly. This really needs to be factored in for the time required from the delivery to the airport to flight departure. Coordination on dry ice limitation as well through proactive initiative between supply chain stakeholders, shippers and regulators have led to accelerate and enable the rollout of the vaccine. In terms of the infrastructure, it's really important that ensuring temperature controlled storage facilities are in place from the manufacturers to the final destination. But it's, again, especially in remote areas, this remains a challenge. And where cold chain has been in place for many years to deal with ongoing vaccine programs, these are now outdated, and the concern to handle a rising number of vaccines is rising. In terms of the public-private partnership, IATA's call for collaborations has really resulted in positive developments between the private and the public sector. And the work with the World Customs Organization resulted really in airline members not encountering specific obstacles so far to current border processes of these critical shipments. Communication is a key driver as well for success. We've seen a reinforcement of multilateral discussion on service and capabilities, where the logistic providers were also very engaged in initiating discussions with the business partners. So moving away from the bilateral historical discussion towards multilateral discussion. On the collaboration, IATA's advocacy role really led many governments and international regulatory bodies to facilitate the movement of air cargo, and IATA will continue that work. Just a few words on the sustainability. An upcoming challenge identifies the biomedical waste. That means the needle, the PPE, the syringes that will need to be destroyed after use, and some countries will require assistance as they don't have the means or the infrastructure to carry out this task. Focus on quality. Companies that have implemented quality-driven strategy programs such as the CIV program, CIV Pharma, have a significant advantage and are well placed to mitigate the impact of logistical constraints in their strategy by defining and adopting risk-based approach while building confidence and trust. And the aspect of security, which is as well key, working effectively with the health and customer organizations is essential, really, to ensure timely regulatory approvals, increased security measures, appropriate handling and customs clearance. So to conclude my presentation, these lessons learned have also demonstrated their applicability not only to other pharmaceutical and life science products. I think there's been a great work that has been achieved by the industry with the vaccines, and that should almost become a standard. But these are as well applicable to other special cargo, such as live animals and perishable, and this latter being an essential commodity transported throughout the crisis. Preserving access to safe food and nutrition is essential as part of the health response, ensuring sustainable development in a collaborative approach, and transport is playing a key role in the overall well-being. And stay tuned, as special cargo will be further developed in 3 tracks during the World Cargo Symposium in October in Istanbul. On that, my next slide. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrea. That's great. We've got time for, I think, maybe just 2 really quick questions. So you went through there a lot of the lessons learned, but could you just highlight the top 3 challenges that the industry faced in distributing the vaccines? So the top 3.
So the top 3, I think one is the element of uncertainty. I think the biggest challenge was the uncertainty, not knowing exactly what was required. And this is where communication was exceptionally important. Manufacturers were developing their vaccines, not really knowing, and the industry not really knowing where from to, how, in which circumstances, what temperature. So the uncertainty was definitely the first biggest challenge. The second was the temperature control environment in which those vaccines had to be transported. As we went through a number of vaccines, as they got the approval, we've seen that some of them had to go and having minus 80, minus 70 Celsius temperatures, whereas others 2 to 8 environment. So again, having the appropriate infrastructure to be able to ensure the integrity of the product is maintained throughout the transport and the distribution. And the third was an aspect of security, which is a challenge. We've seen that early 2020 in March, for example, with the PPE, security measures had to be put in place because of threat, of being stolen. So this is definitely lessons learned that have been then applied on very sensitive product. And safety as well, especially when it comes to theft and tampering the product. So security and safety as a third biggest challenge.
That's great. Thank you, Andrea. I will now move over to Dave Brennan, our Assistant Director of Cargo Safety and Standards, who's going to talk to us about transporting dangerous goods amidst COVID-19, and then briefly on lithium batteries. There were a lot of things that needed to happen so that the industry could, behind the scenes, so the industry could step up and ensure it met that challenge. And Dave, over to you just to go into that in a little bit more detail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good day, everybody. To the next slide, please. So there were some challenges associated with the dangerous goods regulations that had to be addressed to facilitate the speedy movement of the coronavirus vaccines. So just looking at those, we had some issues around over-regulation, if I can say that, of vaccines that pose a very minimal risk in transport, removing the barriers to the response, and supporting the efforts by the airlines to provide a safe and hygienic environment for their passengers and, of course, their crew. Next slide. So in the development of the vaccines, it was identified fairly early on that some of these use genetically modified microorganisms, and there are a number that have been developed and there are some still in development. But these genetically modified microorganisms are subject to the dangerous goods regulations unless they've been authorised for use by the state of origin, by the state of destination, and by any state through which they move. And they get classified as genetically modified organisms or genetically modified microorganisms. And we raised that issue with the WHO and with IATA through the Dangerous Goods Panel, because we saw that this was an unnecessary impediment, bearing in mind that the concerns around GMOs, GMMOs, is more around plants, seeds, and even animals, and where they could interact with the natural environment. And now you get things happening in the natural environment that are unintended. And it was viewed that this really did not apply to materials such as vaccines, which even if you were to break a vial or many of vials, the product will simply be destroyed, and it doesn't interact with the natural environment in the way that plants, seeds, and animals could do. So this was raised with the United Nations Subcommittee of Experts on the Transport of Dangerous Goods late last year, and it was agreed that the provisions around transport of genetically modified materials was not intended to address materials such as vaccines. And as a result, there was a provision changed in the regulations that removed COVID-19 vaccines from classification as genetically modified microorganisms. Next slide, please. Now, many of these vaccines, in fact, most pharmaceuticals, the manufacturers put data loggers and cargo tracking devices in the packages or attach them to packages. And some of this is they want to know where their materials are, that they're supposed to be, they are where they're supposed to be. But also many of the vaccines, as Andrea briefly mentioned, must be kept within a very defined temperature range. And the authorities responsible for approving pharmaceuticals mandate that the manufacturers of the pharmaceutical must be able to verify conformance with the temperature range from the time of manufacture to the time that the vaccine or the pharmaceutical is administered to the patient. And for this reason, they use data loggers that can track the temperature at all times through the transport. Some of these also use more sophisticated devices that are capable of, they have GPS, GSM capabilities. They can actually phone home and say, I'm getting warm, do something. And most of them are powered by lithium batteries. And they need to have a mark on a package because the package contains a lithium battery powered device. But this really was seen as an unnecessary impediment. We, after all, have packages of vaccines with one, perhaps data logger that may have a small AA or even AAA or smaller lithium-ion cell. And it's not being shipped as lithium batteries. It's simply associated with the shipment of the pharmaceuticals. And we raised this again with ICAO and the Dangerous Goods Panel, and there was agreement that adding the lithium battery mark to the packages didn't add any significant safety benefit, and there was therefore no additional hazard or risk in removing that mark from the package or not mandating that the mark be applied. However, those devices that are active, the airlines are still required to approve their use, as they have to meet the relevant airworthiness requirements so that there's no interference with aircraft systems. Next slide. Also, as Andrea mentioned, some of these vaccines must be kept deep frozen. The Pfizer one, for example, has to be shipped at minus 70 Celsius, and for that, dry ice is used as a refrigerant. But dry ice is also a dangerous goods. The concern there is dry ice goes from the solid, carbon dioxide solid, immediately to a gas. It doesn't go through a liquid phase. And in an enclosed area, such as an aircraft cargo compartment and potentially an aircraft cabin, you could end up with a higher level of carbon dioxide, which poses a risk to the safety of the occupants or to people who may enter the cargo compartment. And for that reason, the airlines are required to determine what the maximum quantity of dry ice that they will allow to be carried on their aircraft. The issue there is that most of the data that's been developed and provided to the airlines by the aircraft manufacturers for passenger aircraft, of course, assumes that you've got a full load of passengers on board. And as passengers breathe out, they give off carbon dioxide. But if you've got no passengers in the cabin, then you can exclude that consideration from the limits that you're applying to keep the CO2 levels within the required range. And the other thing is that one of the manufacturers of the vaccines came up with a very sophisticated packaging system that was able to achieve a very, very low sublimation rate of less than 1% per hour. In fact, the sublimation rate was around 0.3% per hour. And the guidance provided by the aircraft manufacturers only went down to about 1%. So we raised this issue with the aircraft manufacturers, with the FAA, and with the European Aviation Safety Agency, EASA, and there was revised guidance developed by the aircraft manufacturers that provided tables that showed the maximum amount of dry ice for passenger aircraft where no passengers are carried, and also to allow for very low sublimation rates. And this allows the airlines to increase the quantity of dry ice that they're carrying without putting people at risk, either the loading staff or the flight crew or the people in the cabin supervising the cargo that may be loaded in the cabin during flight. Next slide. And as I mentioned, the airlines wanted to be able to provide a very safe environment to their crew and the passengers, notwithstanding that we're not carrying a lot of passengers, but where they are being carried, the airlines wanted to be able to provide alcohol-based hand sanitizers for the use by the crew, so cabin crew in the galley, place this in the aircraft lavatories, and even in amenity kits. But the regulations didn't permit that to happen unless the airline had a specific authorisation from their regulatory authority. And at the ICAO Council Aviation Recovery Task Force, they'd identified that the airlines should provide sufficient quantities of cleaning and disinfectant products effective against COVID-19 for use during flight. So based on this, we raised a paper to the ICAO Dangerous Goods Panel proposing that the provisions that allow airlines to carry certain dangerous goods, part of the service in the aeroplane, and other things, that we add alcohol-based hand sanitisers into that standard allowance that the airlines could simply apply without having to seek a specific authorisation. And that too was agreed by ICAO and was adopted through an addendum to the regulations very early in this year. And that allows the airlines to place this alcohol-based hand sanitisers and cleaning products aboard the aircraft. They can determine if they need to carry spare quantities based on the duration of the flight. It may be appropriate to have a amount carried so that you can go out and back and then replenish it back at your home base. Next slide, thank you. And lithium batteries. We've already heard from Nick Careen early on about the challenges lithium batteries present, and that's partly because of the continuing demand. I mean, the consumer demand, mobile phones, tablets, e-bikes, electric scooters, skateboards, electric vehicles, as well as other industries that are making use of lithium batteries, fuels the growth for these very useful energy sources, but they do pose a risk. Next slide, please. And part of the objective is that you identify the risk. You have to know where the problems are, and then look at how we mitigate those. How do we reduce the risk to an acceptable level? And some of it is we still unfortunately see people that either don't know, don't care, or both know and simply choose to ignore the regulations and ship lithium batteries and pretend that they're children's toys, clothing, as what we have seen in one incident, or that they say that they're lithium batteries contained in equipment and instead they're just lithium batteries, and that has a very different set of regulatory requirements. And we need the regulatory authorities to conduct better oversight of the supply chain. And as Nick mentioned, we see the regulators applying more and more regulations to the airlines, and the airlines can only do so much in that they only see the cargo when it is at the airport. And yet there should be oversight and enforcement of the supply chain going right back up to the shippers and everywhere from then until it gets to the airport. There's also, we believe, value in applying supplementary fire protection through the use of fire containment covers, fire-resistant containers, and for non-containerised aircraft, there are fire containment bags. And our challenge here is that there are standards for some of these, but they've only been applied to what's called a Class A fire. So that's fire involving paper, cardboard, normal combustible materials, and lithium batteries are more vigorous in a fire than that. And we need the regulators to step up and develop some standards that then the airlines can make use of based on their own safety risk assessment. We need to look at getting better data. We need to have a better idea of just how big the problem is. Without data, we can't understand how big the problem is and where the problem is worst and attack it there. And one of the opportunities is to look at perhaps specific screening to identify lithium batteries in cargo that has not been declared as containing lithium batteries. The technology exists, but we need to see how we can integrate that with the existing aviation security system. And with that, I will say thank you very much and open to any questions that may be coming through. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Time for, I think, 2 questions. So the first question is, you talked in your presentation about how the industry was able to revise regulations quite quickly. How long would this normally take, and how long did it take to facilitate the transport of vaccines?
Well, the normal regulatory update cycle is over a 2-year period, and clearly we couldn't wait 2 years to make the necessary changes. So we were able to engage with the ICAO Dangerous Goods Panel. It is ICAO that sets the air transport regulations for dangerous goods. We hold a member position on the ICAO Dangerous Goods panel, so we're able to raise that directly with the panel. One of the issues about the hand sanitisers had been raised at their meeting in October and already agreed. The issues around the GMOs, GMMOs and the data loggers came subsequent to the meeting in October, but we were able to move through that relatively quickly and get agreement through the ICAO process that was adopted as of the 1st of January of this year. I think you're on mute, KK.
Sorry, just a final question. Why do you think there's a reluctance among manufacturers and airlines to share data on safety incidents, specifically regarding lithium batteries?
I think some of it goes to concerns about anti-competitive behaviour and being caught up in antitrust legislation and action. We need to be careful. I mean, we have a sharing process that was developed in October of 2019, where we have airlines that have signed up. If they find undeclared dangerous goods, obviously including undeclared lithium batteries, they can share that information with us, very detailed information, and we'll make it available to all of the other participating airlines. But that's done with the understanding that we're not advocating black bans, embargoes, or anything of that nature. We're providing it so that the airlines can use that as part of their own safety risk assessment to determine what additional mitigations they may wish to apply. So it's really that. It's about, there's concerns around privacy. The airlines have to report to their regulatory authorities. We unfortunately see a lack of coordination between regulatory authorities, where an incident that happens in one state, but the goods originated in another, the state that found the incident may make it available to the originating state, but then they don't know what action was taken. We believe that should be taken up by ICAO. There needs to be better coordination between states on the action that they're taking, how they're responding to incidents, and I think that will help other states learn how to go about it. I think there's perhaps a lack of level playing field. I think some states are very sophisticated and others are less so and less resourced, and they may be unsure of how they can go about it or what they should do.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dave. We'll now move over to a topic which we talked about for a long time, and perhaps the pandemic has accelerated this. So digitalisation of air cargo. I'd now like to introduce Henk Mulder, who's our head of digital cargo. Henk, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you for the opportunity to brief you all. If we go to the next slide, I think I probably can summarise what has happened with COVID. It really has had a very strong impact on the acceleration of digitalisation, and there have been a number of points that we can look at that make that very clear. For example, the first one is around the immediate need for touch-free cargo. Very early on in the pandemic, we saw that paper documents were being refused by certain parties within the supply chain. This is, of course, something we've been focused on for a long time, and there are some questions why this takes so long. But it really sort of highlighted the need for the ability to share data completely digitally, and that is something that we saw a very strong impact of. The second thing that we noticed was the importance of telework. We literally went home one day from the next, all of us, including cargo airline staff, to work from home. And of course, that requires tools and the ability to do so, digital systems. When we talk about the slow digitalization of the industry, don't think that cargo people sit behind paper stacks. They don't sit behind screens like you and me. So to a large extent, digitalization has already happened. What hasn't happened, perhaps, is the interactivity between various partners, and we'll look at that in a minute as well. But certainly the need for digital systems connectivity was highlighted by this teleworking and everything that followed. Another element that was very clear from the COVID pandemic is that due to the limited capacity of air freight, the air cargo product became a very high value product. And as a result, the quality of that product became even more important. So when we talk about interactive cargo, things like tracking devices, the need for guaranteeing quality of the transport of goods has gone up significantly with the increase of value of air cargo. So that program has also received a lot of attention in the last year. Another element that saw significant attention is something around digital multimodality, or the multimodal interoperability of the various freight modes. Something we refer to as the Internet of Logistics, the ability to interact via the Internet on anything to do with logistics across the various modes. And again, I'll look into that in a minute, what specifically triggered that. And then lastly, what we noticed during the COVID crisis, even though some of the even cargo airline staff was being furloughed or even let go due to the overall economic situation of airlines, the work around pilots was increasing, not decreasing. In other words, the interest in certain use cases around digitalization was receiving a lot of focus. If we look at the next slide, one of our sort of biggest programs at the moment is One Record, which is a program for data sharing. In other words, a standardized API and a standardized data model, but also around data security. And initially, during the COVID crisis in 2020, we were a bit concerned about potential participation of airlines in this. And in fact, the opposite from what we expected happened. It got more attention and not less. And so in 2020 and the early part of 2021, we've managed to convert that attention into a significant increase in documentation, in events that we organize to explain what it is, but perhaps more importantly, the number of pilots that were running around this topic. And so, for example, we saw that once we got past the basic use cases, and use cases, things like how to transport an e-airway bill using a data sharing environment, which to most of the industry is basic in the sense that we already know how to do that. We're not inventing anything here, but using the One Record environment. Where things got far more interesting is when we started looking at what can you do with data sharing outside the traditional business. And so things like aligning tracking and flight movements is something that is happening, of course, but when you start sharing data, this becomes a lot more transparent. So the trucks don't show up before the flight has arrived, or vice versa, that when the freight is actually in the warehouse, the trucks actually get there within hours, not days. And so these sort of use cases became apparent. Other things that One Record is attracting is also interfacing with other technologies that are relatively standard in our normal lives, things like WhatsApp. Integrating WhatsApp with the flight information or the status of the freight is something that's becoming more common. And it's very much this One Record program that is inciting airlines and their partners to embrace digitalization at the full and go beyond the basic stuff of just transporting information. If we look at the next slide, we have developed a number of tools and products in 2020 that really are really shifting the boundaries of what we can do and what we cannot do. One of the things that we focus on a lot around One Record is making everything available publicly for free and easily. So all of the standard, all of the documentation is all available on a website or on a GitHub, where all of the hard data is, things like API specifications, data specification. It's all there right now. We also developed a developer portal to help the IT people in the companies, and as well as their subject matter expert colleagues, to make sense of this and to actually get the right level of information for what they need, whether that is training, whether that is very detailed explanations of things like APIs. We also focused on products. And so last year we launched Epic Enhanced Partner Identification Connectivity, which is really a tool that allows airlines and their partners, whether they're forwarders or the CCS community, to publish what they can do in different markets. In other words, to publish their connectivity details. Not quite a telephone directory, something far more intelligent than that. But the ability to find out how you can communicate with an airline is central to the ability to accelerate digitalization. We have lots of plans for 2021 as well. things like building tools to demonstrate what one record can do. We also intend to do something we refer to as interoperability with other standards, and I'll come back to that when I talk about interoperability with other freight modes in a minute. When we look at the next slide, we can see that the work that we have done around interactive cargo is something that has really taken a lot of meaning during the COVID crisis. Interactive cargo is really about the use of tracking devices and data loggers that was mentioned earlier as well. Things like, of course, the COVID vaccine shipments, they all have data loggers, but it's not the only thing that carries data loggers. In fact, as I mentioned, the increased value of air freight as a product requires an improved quality as well. And so a lot of these devices are really about guaranteeing the quality of the transport of the goods, whatever they are. And so a lot of the work around this program has been about removing things like hurdles around device approvals. And just to give an example of that, one of the airlines that is involved in the development with this and was doing some testing managed to reduce their approval process from 90 days to 30 days. Well, that is a significant acceleration. That's a factor 300% just for that particular part of the process. But there have been other work that was done as well around this. Things like clarifying the use of data. These devices collect data, and the airlines wanted to make sure they get access to the data in case there's an issue that they need to be aware of. And then lastly, something that we weren't expecting, of course, when we started the whole project, which was at the end of 2019, was the increased interest from the industry in doing pilots around this topic. As you can imagine, once you start using this technology, this IoT technology to track the quality of freight, there's a lot more you can do. And so the interest in pilots was something that was very tangible, more so than in some cases the work around one record, some of it was very, very basic in terms of data transport. So there are some really good use cases around pharma, for example, that are being tested at the moment with great success. If we look at the next slide, this is one of the really interesting impacts of COVID. There's sort of many angles to this, but really the reduction in capacity in freight has forced everybody in the global economy, whether they are forwarders or shippers, to rethink how they can ship things and how they can maximize the network that's available to them, and when in fact that network is very limited. This in turn then renewed interest in the various transport modes to cooperate and work together. We're in a far more interconnected and interdependent world. And so one of the sort of the buzzwords that is going on right now is something we refer to as interoperability or digital interoperability, which means the ability to operate with other platforms, in particular digital platforms, without necessarily going through a whole phase of aligning all the standards and integrating systems, because if anything we've learned, that is very hard. And so the focus is on, well, how can we interoperate without actually becoming single platforms? This is something that was really brought to the fore with the COVID-19 crisis, but also more recently with the Suez Canal, where all of a sudden the shippers had to face choices. They have this maritime freight getting stuck on one side of the canal. And now, do you go around Africa or do you shift to other modes of transport? And whatever it is that you do, you're going to need the ability to get data on whatever the current situation is, but also on how you replan your shipment journeys. Similarly, the crisis itself, the COVID crisis, also gave significant increase in the use of e-commerce. This, of course, then led to the increased use of air freight, where most of the e-commerce is being transported. E-commerce by nature is digital, right? Everything you buy online is digital. These companies, whether it's Amazon or Cainiao, any Alibaba, any of these companies, they're digital by nature. This is how they were born. And so obviously the freight that's being transported needs to match that. And so, again, we see an increased interest in digitalization, which is something that is a general trend in our society. If we look at the next slide, then we'll see that, there is no next slide, but I was going to make a comment on the standards that are being piloted. Many companies are now involved in this. Across various modes, many companies now are also launching services, including IT services, to make it easier for the customer. And really, perhaps in summary, we've said before that digitalization accelerates air cargo. What we're now seeing is that when air cargo is a limited resource, it itself accelerates digitalization. So it's a virtuous circle that will most definitely see a significant increase and improvement of digitalization, which was some of the questions we saw earlier proposing. So I think we can expect to see a lot of progress in the next few years. And with that, I will open up to any question that there may be.
Thanks, Henk. Just one question. Do you feel that we've reached a tipping point in terms of digitalization of the industry? And do you believe that COVID, that the pandemic has caused that, or?
Yes, I do. I absolutely do. I think we're already heading towards it. I think already e-commerce and digitalization society were sort of pushing that particular agenda. I think that COVID has really, really underscored how much we are dependent on digitalization of our economy, of our lives, but also of air transport. In terms of sort of the tipping point, we are seeing more companies active in this area. We are seeing that the agenda of the airlines is changing, as Willie mentioned earlier as well. When it comes to prioritization, this is on the top of the list of most airlines. And as a result, this then impacts their customers, their supply chain, and their IT suppliers. So yes, absolutely. I think we're seeing that.
And then just a final question. Are we seeing any disparity in terms of digitalization of air cargo in different regions? Or is it the whole industry working together?
No, I do think there is a disparity. And I think it's a disparity that's across every area in air cargo. It's not just digitization. When we see economies like North America, like Europe, like most of Asia, they have the ability and the funds to be able to respond to the needs here. At the same time, and I think it's something that I think it was Brian that mentioned it earlier, where, for example, in Latin America, they are constrained when it comes to dealing with the current issue. This then impacts digitalization as well. So those areas where they're struggling to operate their airlines as it is, they're going to be struggling with the digitalization as well. On the plus side, the digitalization doesn't necessarily mean a lot of investment. I think the technologies that we're seeing today, certainly the standards, but the technology itself is very, very accessible. This is not like the archaic systems that we used to operate 30, 40 years ago. Technology these days is very accessible. In fact, even those markets that you might wonder whether they're going to manage, every single citizen walks around with mobile phones, which is about as high-tech as it gets when it comes to digitalization. So I think even in those markets, I think there's a significant opportunity to follow. They may not be setting the trends, but it will most definitely be following it.
Thank you, Henk. We'll now move over to the topic of e-commerce. I'm sure most of us have been in lockdown at some stage over the past year and a half, and we may not have used e-commerce before, but for me, certainly I have now. So I'd now like to pass over to Brendan, who's our head of e-commerce and cargo operations, just to give us an update on the effects of the pandemic on e-commerce and opportunities we have for the industry. Thanks, Brendan.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all. You can move to the next slide right away. As mentioned by a few people, really e-commerce, well, the pandemic in general has shifted consumer behaviors quite drastically in 2020. You can see the figures here on the screen in terms of where worldwide e-commerce is going to reach, $5 trillion in 2021. And with that growth has come significant transactional increase. So that means it's not just one or two buyers buying in larger volumes, but you have many, many, many more customers. We all went into lockdown and we all started shopping as a result of that lockdown. Also with that comes the voice of the consumer. Consumers are making things very, very clear. They are injecting their levels of service
and their requirements onto the various logistics service providers. They're indicating their preferences for sustainability, for example, carbon neutral delivery or sustainable packaging. If you can move to the next slide, we'll take a little step back and take a look at e-commerce distribution globally in 2019. So in 2019, we had uneven growth, right? Some countries were capitalizing on the e-commerce trend more than others. In particular, large countries, US and China, biggest e-commerce markets, due to a number of different factors. So that's population size, total GDP, manufacturing capabilities, internet penetration in those countries, and so on. And both of those countries had significant opportunity for both cross-border and domestic air cargo and e-commerce. Not to mention that in addition to that, the connection between those two regions is one of the largest international air cargo routes there is. Now, it doesn't discount emerging markets. There is a significant opportunity for cross-border e-commerce growth from emerging markets in the next period of time. And if you move to the next slide, jump forwards a little bit to what's happened during the pandemic. And really, we had exponential growth around the world, especially in the United States, in Latin America. In the United States, we moved 3 years ahead during the pandemic period. In Latin America, 5 years ahead. In China, we moved 2 years ahead. China represents now, e-commerce represents of retail a little over 50%, so more than half of retail sales is going through e-commerce as a result directly of the pandemic period. If you can move to the next slide. We began to analyze this trend in 2019 in real detail and started to look at how we might be able to categorize this for the industry and then identify what some of the problems might be to enable airlines and the industry in general to capitalize on it, and then propose solutions or what opportunities there might be. And we broke it into 4 different models. So we've got owned and fully dedicated air transport capabilities. These are where large e-commerce providers predominantly will get access to and confirm their capacity directly. In some cases, they'll control it directly by operating that. In other cases, it might be leasing arrangements, but it's a very tight control on their capacity, and something that a few large players do, and some do a mix of that. Then we have the classic air freight shipper, where e-commerce volumes are still consolidated, and they move through classic freight channels. The interesting part there is that, of course, the challenge, the requirements for visibility, the requirements for transparency still exist, even though it's in what might appear at various moments in the transportation chain to be a classic consolidation. We have hybrid models as well, making up a mix of different types, where it's classic air cargo, their own capabilities, and then maybe some courier, express, or parcel type movements, so the mail and others. Each of these different models, and these are sort of a generalization along with which players are actually in the models, each of them comes with a set of challenges. If we're looking at where it's a hybrid model, you now have many different potential options for capacity, but you haven't confirmed necessarily any of it until moments when you're trying to fulfill goods, which can be quite a challenge, especially during the capacity constrained pandemic period. And then if you're looking at, for example, the courier, express, or parcel, you then possibly have lack of visibility, as we see as those end up getting handed over from partner to partner. If you can move to the next slide. Part of the research that we did, we engaged with a number of these e-commerce players to identify how we can take some of those pain points that we identified and turn them into opportunities. Then depending on the degree to which an airline or another player wishes to enter the e-commerce market, they could adopt one or more of them. And just to illustrate why that's so important, I mean, 80% of cross-border e-commerce is transported by air. and that's over 20% of the total global e-commerce trade value. So it's very clear air cargo is built for e-commerce, but this is a real functional shift. It still has a significant amount of complexity to deal with. There are different regulations in different countries or in different regions, and those need solving by, in some cases, logistics service providers or maybe the marketplace themselves. The customers, as I mentioned earlier on, are injecting either through their shopping habit or through survey responses, their required levels of service. And so you have hundreds of millions of individuals who are looking to say, this is what I expect. Transit time is definitely a critical element, which is why air cargo is so well adapted, but also is the visibility side. That's absolutely key. So which solutions get deployed should be based on what model the customers are looking to engage with, and how digital they are at that point, and how they want to connect with their various partners. If we look at the current level of e-commerce, around 16 to 20% of global air freight is e-commerce or e-commerce driven, and that could increase, will increase between now and the next few years. It doesn't stop with what types of services they want. The customer is also voicing how clearly they need sustainable solutions, reusable packaging, recyclable packaging, and so on. If you can move to the next slide. And many players have already begun transforming. Those who had solid digital practices at the start of this are ahead, but it is still time to capitalize on that demand, embrace the opportunity that the e-commerce brings, and build a robust air cargo strategy for e-commerce that takes into account all of the different views of the customer. If you can move to the next slide, and this is not only for e-commerce, this is true of all of air cargo, that sustainability is becoming even more so than it has been the core of what we do. We looked at all of our different standards and all of our different best practices to ensure that sustainability becomes the center of those, that it is a contributing part to those standards and the adoption of sustainable practices. And we want to make sure that we enable the industry to implement those sustainable and innovative solutions, and be in the driver's seat for those. As was mentioned earlier on by Willie Walsh, it's one of the main priorities of the air cargo industry, and therefore we need to ensure that we have robust strategies to do so. And if you can move to the next slide, our approach has been to place these into 5 different action areas, and in each of those we have different projects or initiatives. So on the people side, we have, for example, the FACE program, looking at attracting and retaining talent, but also looking at diversity and inclusion. On the planet side, notwithstanding what's happening in the aviation environment, but also digital transformation, electrification of the vehicles that we use in and around air cargo, as well as electrification and improving the way the buildings are designed and built. Prosperity, creating a profitable, efficient industry. And on the peace front, a lot of our standard setting activities create a common platform for competitiveness, and e-commerce is one of these things as well that drives connectivity between different parties, and that inevitably enhances that. And lastly, the partnership side, where we look at our various engagements to ensure that we have the right partners. Many of our challenges won't be solved alone, as just airlines or as just ground handlers, and they require the entire industry to engage, to share data, to share insights, and to partner for this future that we see. So with that, I'll leave it there, and I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Brendan. We have a question here. Is IATA working with or engaged with the freight arms of the big e-commerce giants that have their own capabilities? And how much efficiency are they driving in the market? And then just in terms of the split of these big e-commerce giants with their own capabilities versus the capabilities of the smaller companies, do you have any statistics on the split there in terms of market share?
In terms of global market share, so to answer the first part of the question, we are engaged with every one of the major marketplaces and e-commerce providers or their logistics arms, in most cases both, where we look at their consumer-driven as well as their logistics-driven initiatives. They are driving efficiency without a doubt. This is a major functional shift in the way the air cargo industry works. There are new parties engaging for air cargo services that have never requested, they've never been directly involved before, and they are very digital, extremely digital at their core, and so that requires their partners to be digital. In terms of the market share, so your Amazon, the entire Alibaba group, and for example, maybe one or two others, JD, you're going to be looking at the lion's share of the market, 50-60% of the market for global e-commerce worldwide. And then if you're looking, I don't have the numbers. This is always where it starts to get a little bit more challenging, but on each individual and how much they take in terms of logistics space, then it gets a little bit more challenging. But in terms of the global penetration, 50-60% for the top three e-commerce marketplaces, which is significant, obviously.
Thanks, Brendan. And then just a final question. Have you got any examples of innovations in sustainability that we've seen in the cargo industry recently?
Sure. We have quite a few on the logistics space involving package reduction and package waste reduction, where they look at different reusable packaging, as well as more specific to air cargo, reduction of single-use plastics. So we use plastic sheeting very often for inclement weather protection. And there have been a number of different providers who offer now alternative solutions which are significantly more sustainable to using plastic shrink wrap or plastic sheeting for that protection.
Thanks, Brendan. That's great. We'll now move on to our final speaker before Nick closes Cargo Media Daylight. Keeping air cargo flying through the pandemic has been crucial, and border facilitation and border management has been key to doing that. So I'd now like to hand over to Christian Piaget, our Head of Cargo Border Management, to just update you on what we've been doing and prioritise.
Thanks, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Yes, I'm going to give you a quick overview of our work with border agencies and more specifically customs authorities as they play such a crucial role in the flow of their cargo. And I think this crucial role has been more obvious than ever in the last 15 months because we are back in a situation that we haven't seen since actually the Second World War in terms of confinement and borders roles. So I'm going to explain what we have done to ensure the cross-border movement of cargo and also what we will continue to do beyond the pandemic, of course. So I'm starting with this quote from our former CEO, emphasizing the role of government, because the role of governments was actually a key concern for us at the core of our preoccupations when the pandemic started. We were indeed very concerned that the cross-border movement of first the personal protective equipment, what we call the PPEs, and then the vaccines would be severely delayed by red tape at the border. But I must say we've been actually positively surprised by the border agency's eagerness to make sure that the vaccine distribution would not be delayed. I mean, of course, you would expect that nobody would want to be identified as slowing down the distribution of vaccines, but there's often a gap between expectations and good intentions and the harsh reality, especially when you're dealing with administrations. So I must admit that in this case, we have not faced many troubles from a customs operations perspective. Next slide, please. So the cooperation, in particular with the World Customs Organization and other international and regional organizations, has been actually quite great over the past months. It has really helped to make sure that the administrative burdens will not delay the vaccines distribution, because right from the start of the lockdown crisis, IATA, together with other trade partners, it's not only IATA, but also the freight forwarders, the express carriers, and shippers, trade associations, have met with the WCO Secretariat every 2 weeks, virtually, to share our respective experiences with first the distribution of these protective personal equipment, and then with the incoming vaccines movements to define how these international organizations could actually help us. The fact is that at the beginning of the crisis, it was obvious that governments were not well prepared to respond to such a crisis. There was absolutely no business continuity plans, or if there were any, they were out of date. Governments had not designed or triggered specific regulations and procedures to define essential goods or essential services. They had no real procedure in place to clear these critical shipments expeditiously. But thanks to these virtual meetings we were having with the WCO and these other organizations throughout the crisis, the organization, as well as regional organizations like DigiTaxud from the European Commission, for example, did actually a great job in terms of first gathering information and also spreading information internationally or nationally on the various mechanisms and good practices that were put in place to identify and facilitate the movements of COVID-19 related shipments. This meeting helped to provide effective mechanisms for identifying critical medicines and vaccine shipments during import or export to enable these goods to be treated with the utmost urgency during these customs procedures. Another example is when the WCO made available to Customs Administration a list of what we call HS codes, which is the technical way of identifying specific cargo items. That list defined which shipments should be treated as a priority. And this has been actually very useful, I would even say invaluable for the air cargo supply chain, already for the dispatch of the masks, but as well for the other medical supplies. So the vaccines is one aspect, but there are also many other shipments that are also related to the COVID-19 crisis, like the test kits, the swabs, the gloves, the protective garments, the disinfectants, the ventilators, and all these various other medical devices. So to have a clear list of what fell under those categories was very useful. We also managed in those discussions with the WCO to maintain the existence of certificates, for instance, those that are used by trusted operators, trusted traders, authorized economic operators, like they are called in the customs world, and to make sure that this certificate could be prolonged despite the challenging conditions that resulted from the lockdown situation, because that made physical audits not possible, for example, but there was this agreement to prolong these certifications. That was also quite useful for our industry. Next slide, please. IATA is also created with the support of partners like the World Trade Organization, the UNCTAD, the Commonwealth of Small State Office, the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, and the International Trade Center. You can see all the logo on this slide. We created with them a specific platform consolidating all initiatives on trade facilitation by international organizations and stakeholders. And this is now hosted on the WTO website with the objective to provide to governments and also to supply chain actors access to relevant resources in a unique and user-friendly way with a user-friendly database. It contained useful listing of all of the relevant initiatives broken down by organization, type of measures, and subject matters. And this was particularly important at the beginning of the pandemic, when we were in a context where relevant information had become abundant and dispersed in many different platforms, making it hard for policymakers and trade operators to have a thorough overview of such measures. So we also cooperated with the World Customs Organization to access emergency contacts in countries to ensure that cargo border blockages could be responded to immediately. We were supported by the ICAO, which issued state letters to urge member states to further facilitate air cargo flows. We also contributed to the work of the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, which is an alliance led by donor countries and private sector representatives. And that work is meant at facilitating the customs clearance of vaccines in certain regions. We provided specific inputs and technical support for projects that are recently taking place, that have recently started in Asia. So I think it's important to note that while there are current issues with the distribution of medical material, those are not due to border management. The problem with distribution is more at source, where offer is struggling to match demand, and also where sometimes protectionist measures are put in place. There are also problems at destination, but that's mostly for the domestic leg, when the infrastructure is not adequate to deliver the shipments at the final destination. But there are no real distribution problem from an international air transport logistics perspective. It's more policy issues and domestic challenges, and I think that was really something that was not a given at the beginning of the crisis. So we were really satisfied to note this. Next slide, please. This crisis has made one thing quite clear. The measures that are contained in international instruments, like the Revised Kyoto Convention or the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which you can see on this slide, do not help only to facilitate trade. They also contribute to national health and safety. These international instruments support measures that IATA has been promoting tirelessly, like paperless procedures, automated systems, electronic data exchange, e-payments, adequate risk management. These are all measures that have suddenly come at the forefront of the strategy of governments during the pandemic, because they reduce physical contacts to a minimum, they allow to focus controls on high-risk goods only, and they ensure that systems and processes are less vulnerable to the sudden staff shortages that we have seen last year due to the sudden unavailability of transports to go to airports and border stations. So, like Henk has mentioned, the home working environment is provided a new context, and this type of tools can help with this as well. So now, of course, our intention is to maintain this momentum that we have seen over the past months. We want to ensure that these practices that have been put in place to replace physical paper-based processes will not only be temporary. They should be maintained after the lockdown have disappeared. Furthermore, they should not be limited only to vaccines and medical goods. They should extend to all cargo. These tools have proven to be useful and feasible, so there is no reason to go backwards again. So that's why we're calling on customs to continue implementing this WCO Revised Kyoto Convention on the World Trade Organization Trade Facilitation Agreement. Or for countries that have not yet ratified these instruments, we are calling on them to ratify them as soon as possible. So we want to avoid that we go back to business as usual and renounce to the agility that these tools have demonstrated during the pandemic. Next slide, please. And that's my last slide. This is another topic with customs, but it's linked to the discussion we've had until now, because this is linked to the surge of e-commerce that we are seeing. Customs, because of the surge of e-commerce, are increasingly interested to maintain adequate scrutiny on the increasing number of shipments that are coming by air. So I will provide you a short update now on how the border agencies are undertaking this scrutiny and what is going to apply in the months to come. But first, maybe just a small recap on what we're talking about here. So since 2005, customs authorities have started to request advanced electronic information from air carriers in order to undertake risk assessment before the goods are delivered on the customs territory at destination. And we have now more than 65 countries, customs administration, which are effectively requesting to receive electronic cargo information before arrival. And we have an additional 50 countries which have declared their intention to do that in some form or scope. Of course, airlines and customs have the same interest to prevent abuses in the transport of air cargo. Not only does it ensure a targeting of high-risk cargo, but it also facilitates the flow of legitimate cargo by speeding up the clearance processes at destination. We unfortunately have to spend still a lot of time making sure that these requirements remain aligned with the international standards that we have contributed to develop with the World Customs Organization, and we still see countries going up and above the standard data requirements, and that is actually an extensive work to scale this back to what is internationally recognized as being useful for risk assessment. Also, in addition to requesting data before arrival, some countries are moving to requesting data before loading, and the focus here is on improvised explosive devices, basically bombs, based on a selection of data elements that are available well before the cargo is brought inside the aircraft. And these preloading requirements are in place now for almost 3 years in the United States. If we don't count the 10 years that it has taken to pilot this project before it became an enforceable program. And we will see these similar programs to start deploying as well in other countries, especially the EU, the UK, and Canada are working on this. And we know there are a few more countries in the pipeline as well. So in Canada and UK, we are already at the pilot stage. And in the EU, the first phase of the requirements has started in March of this year. So because of the increasing importance of e-commerce, the European Union will not only focus on air cargo, but also on air mail. And that's an important challenge for us because it means that not only air carriers are impacted, but also the postal authorities. And that's a first. That's something that we haven't seen in air cargo, advanced cargo information requirements until now. So as of this year in Europe, express carriers and postal authorities must transmit to the European member states advanced data before shipments are loaded on the aircraft. And as of 2023, so in 2 years, all air carriers will have to report all cargo and also mail coming into or transiting through the European Union before arriving on the European territory, before actually loading the goods at the last point of destination to the European territory. We have already the international standards in place for this. IATA has also developed recommended practices and business processes. But as always with this type of program, the devil is in the details, and the challenge of deploying this requirement in 27 countries, actually 29, because that covers also Switzerland and Norway, in one go, must not be underestimated. So this is going to take a lot of our energy in Europe. And our work with DigiTaxud, DigiMove, and Universal Postal Union, UPU, will continue in the coming months in order to be ready by 2023. We'll also continue to assist Canada, the UK, and the other countries that wish to implement those requirements. With this, I'm ready for any question. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Just a question on the revised Kyoto Convention of the World WCO. How many countries have ratified that and implemented it?
That's a good question. I think it's. I've just let me check. I think it's 127 countries for the revised Kyoto Convention, and 107 countries for the TFA. But
we can check and get back to.
I have the number here. So perfect. It's 127 countries for the revised Kyoto Convention, and the TFA is 153 countries.
Brilliant. And then just a final question before we hand over to Nick to wrap up. It seems that there were new levels of border facilitation due to the pandemic. Do you think that this will continue post-pandemic? Are you optimistic that it will continue?
Well, like I said, we will work on this. Whether I'm optimistic, yes, I am optimistic. I think it would make no sense to go backward. The administrations have probably seen also the benefits of also the cooperation that can take place, because the WCO has really been the relationship with the private sector at the forefront of addressing this pandemic, and I don't think after such cooperation that we can go backwards. So yes, I'm optimistic, but there will be a lot of work to do, and as always, it will depend also of the different regions and the different cultures we are dealing with. That's inevitable.
Okay, thank you very much. Nick, thank you to all the speakers, and thank you for the journalists that have joined. Nick, can I just pass over to you for a final closing?
Yeah, no problem. Thanks, Catherine, for pulling this together. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today and participating in this. Thanks to the cargo team for pulling together what amounts to a significant amount of effort and detail, as you can see. A lot of moving parts at the moment, as cargo is one of the thriving areas, as we mentioned at the very beginning, in terms of its growth. So thanks for bearing with us. Thanks for your intelligent questions. They were thought-provoking as well. And don't forget, we are on the cusp of things beginning to go back to some kind of normal, depending on what part of the world you're in. And we are planning our digital cargo events this fall, as well as the World Cargo Symposium. So we hope the next time we see this or do this with you guys, it's actually in person. So with that, I think I wish everybody a great day, and thanks again for your participation.
Thanks, Nick. And just a reminder to everybody that we'll be posting the presentations as well as the speaking points of our key speakers on IATA.org. So thanks, everybody, for joining, and we will see you again soon. Next Global